The file arrived on a Thursday with no warning and no context. Just the file, transmitted through the standard cultural exchange protocol that Earth had established with the Conclave Civilizational Studies Division 14 years ago. The protocol that produced a steady low-volume stream of human cultural artifacts that the division received and cataloged and filed, and occasionally reviewed when someone had time, which was not always. Because the division's primary function was active research, and the cultural exchange protocol produced passive receipts, and passive receipts accumulated in the queue behind the active work. The file had been in the queue for 6 weeks when senior researcher Voth Thessaly finally got to it. Thessaly had been in the Civilizational Studies Division for 18 years, and had the specific professional thoroughness of someone who believed that the queue existed to be worked through, and that the working through was the job even when the items in the queue were, in her professional assessment, unlikely to produce anything that required significant analytical attention. The file was labeled in Earth's cataloging system: entertainment media, horror genre, feature film, runtime 94 minutes, rating, appropriate for mature audiences. The accompanying documentation described it as a representative example of a major human entertainment genre, with significant cultural relevance across multiple Earth populations, and a production history spanning more than a century. Thessaly had not previously encountered the horror genre designation. She ran a terminology search. The search returned the definition from Earth's cultural database. The definition said, a genre of entertainment designed to evoke fear, dread, and related negative emotional states in the audience as a form of recreation. Thessaly read the definition. She read it again. She filed a note in her working document that said, verify translation accuracy. Check for errors in terminology rendering. She ran the verification. The translation was accurate. She sat with that for a moment. She ran another search, this time on the production history the documentation had referenced. The search returned a substantial result. The horror genre had been a documented feature of human entertainment since approximately the late 19th century of Earth's calendar, which was several decades before the species had achieved any significant technological development, and more than a century before first contact with any other spacefaring civilization. The genre had produced tens of thousands of works across multiple media formats including written narrative, visual performance, audio recording, and the motion picture format of which the current file was an example. The genre was not fringe. The documentation described it as mainstream, as one of the most commercially successful categories of human entertainment across the full span of its production history, with consistent audience demand across all human populations and cultures regardless of significant cultural variation in other areas. Thessaly added another note to her working document. The note said, "This is not a small cultural artifact. This appears to be a significant and sustained feature of human entertainment culture. Review with full attention before cataloging." She watched the file. 94 minutes. She watched all 94 minutes. When the 94 minutes were over, she sat in her research office for approximately 20 minutes without doing anything. Then she called her colleague, a senior researcher named Dreven Vorath, who had been in the division for 22 years and whose area of specialization was comparative emotional response across species, and said, "I need you to watch something." Vorath watched it. When it was over, he also sat quietly for a period. Then he said, "They made this voluntarily." Thessaly said, "Yes." He said, "No one required them to make this." Thessaly said, "The documentation indicates it was produced for commercial purposes. It was intended to be seen by a paying audience." Vorath said, "People paid to experience this." Thessaly said, "Yes, the documentation indicates significant commercial success. substantial paying audience. He said, and the audience, she said, sought the experience, voluntarily by choice, with payment. He said, for recreation. She said, that is how the genre is classified, recreational entertainment. He said, the experience of fear and dread is recreational for them. She said, that is what the documentation indicates. He said, they made something specifically designed to produce fear and dread in themselves, and then paid to have it done to them as a recreational activity. And this has been a significant feature of their entertainment culture for over a century. She said, that is an accurate summary of what the documentation describes. He said, and this is one example. She said, a representative example. The documentation says tens of thousands of works in this genre exist. He said, tens of thousands. She said, yes. He said, of things specifically designed to be frightening. She said, and watched for enjoyment, yes. He looked at the display where the file had been playing. He said, I want to look at the full production history before I say anything else. I want to understand the scope of this before I characterize it. She said, I was about to suggest the same thing. They spent 3 weeks on the full production history. The full production history was extensive in ways that the initial documentation had understated. It was not tens of thousands of works when you counted across all media formats. It was significantly more than tens of thousands of works. It was a creative tradition that had been continuously active for more than a century, and that had evolved and developed and spawned subgenres and aesthetic movements and critical traditions and academic study, and the specific cultural infrastructure that surrounded things that were not marginal but central. The horror genre was central to human entertainment culture. Not universal. Not every human was an audience member. The documentation was specific that individual humans varied in their engagement with the genre, and that some humans actively avoided it. But the audience was large and consistent and demographically broad, and had been large and consistent and demographically broad for the full century plus of the genre's documented existence. At the end of 3 weeks, Thessaly and Vorath called a research meeting. They invited the division's full senior research team, 8 researchers including themselves, the most experienced civilizational analysts the Conclave's division had. They presented the findings. The presentation took 4 hours because the material was extensive, and because the researchers had questions that the presentation generated, and because some of the questions led to additional material being presented in response. At the end of 4 hours, the senior researcher of the group, a Drakvari named Koron who had been in the division for 31 years, and who had a reputation for the kind of analytical clarity that came from 3 decades of studying civilizations and learning to see past surface appearances to underlying patterns, said, I want to make sure I have understood the central finding correctly. Thessaly said, yes. Koron said, the human species, in common with every other spacefaring species documented in the Conclave's research archive, experiences fear as a response to perceived threats. Fear serves the evolutionary function of motivating avoidance behavior. This is a universal feature of complex cognition across species. Every species we have documented experiences fear. Every species we have documented seeks to avoid the conditions that produce fear. This is not remarkable. Thessaly said, yes. He said, what is remarkable is that humans have, uniquely among the species we have documented, developed a cultural practice of deliberately inducing the experience of fear in themselves in controlled conditions for the purpose of enjoyment. Thessaly said, yes. He said, they have not only done this, they have done it extensively, continuously, across all human cultures, for more than a century, producing tens of thousands of works dedicated to this practice and sustaining a large and commercially significant audience for those works. Thessaly said, yes. He said, and they find it enjoyable. Thessaly said, The documentation is consistent on this point. The experience of fear in the horror genre context is reported by audience members as enjoyable. There is research literature in the human academic tradition analyzing why this is the case. He said, human researchers have studied why their own species enjoys being frightened. She said, yes, the research literature is substantial. He said, what conclusions does it reach? She said, multiple conclusions that are not fully consistent with each other, which is characteristic of human academic literature on complex questions. The most significant conclusions include the following. First, the experience of fear in controlled, safe conditions allows humans to process fear responses without actual threat, which some researchers describe as a form of practice or rehearsal for genuine threat response. Second, the physiological state produced by fear, including elevated heart rate and specific neurochemical responses, is experienced as pleasurable when the source of the fear is known to be not genuinely threatening. Third, the horror genre provides a structured framework for engaging with death, loss, violence, and other significant human concerns in a context where engagement is voluntary and temporary. Coron said they practice fear. Thessaly said some human researchers describe it that way, yes. He said they rehearse the fear response in controlled conditions. Thessaly said that is one interpretation in the research literature. He said they have been doing this for a century. Thessaly said the documented production history begins in the late 19th century of Earth's calendar. Yes. He said a century of practicing fear responses. Voreth said, Director, I want to add something to what Thessaly has described. Coron said, yes. Voreth said, the horror genre is not the only cultural practice of this type in human civilization. It is the most documented because the production history is the most extensive and the commercial scale is the most significant. But the research literature describes related practices that predate the horror genre and that the genre appears to have evolved from. He said, human oral narrative traditions across all documented human cultures include stories specifically intended to produce fear in the listener. These traditions predate writing. The production of frightening stories appears to be one of the earliest documented human cultural practices. Coron said, they have been doing this since before they had writing. Voreth said, the evidence suggests that producing frightening narratives is one of the original human cultural practices, something they have been doing since the earliest stages of their documented cultural development. He said, and the horror genre is the current technological form of a practice that goes back to the beginning of human cultural life. Coron said, they have been scaring themselves for fun since the beginning. Voreth said, that is consistent with the evidence. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the other researchers, a young Velthun named Prieth who had been in the division for 3 years and who had been listening to the presentation with the expression of someone whose baseline assumptions were being revised in real time, said, I want to ask a question. Coron said, yes. Prieth said, every species we have documented fears the dark, literal darkness, the absence of light. This is universal. It is an evolutionary feature associated with the increased vulnerability to predation that darkness produces. Every species has it. Coron said, yes. Prieth said, humans also fear the dark. The horror genre frequently uses darkness as a primary fear stimulus. The human research literature confirms that darkness is one of the most universal human fear triggers. Coron said, yes. Prieth said, and humans deliberately put themselves in darkness to watch horror films. The room was quiet. She said, the standard presentation format for horror films in human cinema involves a darkened theater. The audience sits in darkness to watch content designed to frighten them. She said, They deliberately replicate the conditions of one of their most universal fears in order to better experience the content designed to trigger their other fears. She said, they make themselves afraid of the environment in order to enhance the experience of being afraid of the content. Voreth said, yes. Priyeth said, voluntarily. Voreth said, yes. Priyeth said, for recreation. Voreth said, yes. Priyeth said, I do not have a framework for this. Voreth said, neither did I when Thessaly showed me the file. Koran said, let us build one. He said, what does the horror genre tell us about the human species that we did not know before finding this material in the queue? Thessaly said, I have been thinking about this for 3 weeks. He said, tell me. She said, the standard framework we use for analyzing a species' relationship with fear is the avoidance model. The avoidance model says, species experience fear. Fear motivates avoidance of the fear stimulus. Avoidance is adaptive because it reduces exposure to genuine threat. The model predicts that species will minimize voluntary exposure to fear stimuli. She said, humans do not fit the avoidance model. She said, humans have a different relationship with fear than the avoidance model describes. The horror genre is evidence that humans have developed the capacity to decouple the fear response from the avoidance motivation. They can experience fear without being motivated to avoid. They have turned the fear response into something they can engage with voluntarily, controllably, selectively. She said, and they have been practicing this decoupling for a century, possibly longer. Koran said, the implications. She said, the implications are significant. A species that has decoupled the fear response from the avoidance motivation has a different relationship with threat than a species that has not. The fear response is still there. They still experience fear, but the experience of fear does not automatically produce avoidance. They have learned to sit with it. She said they have been practicing sitting with it in controlled conditions for a century, in the dark, voluntarily, for enjoyment. Voreth said, and then they encounter actual threats. Thessaly said, and then they encounter actual threats with a century of practice at experiencing fear without being driven to avoid. Koran said, the operational implications. Voreth said, every engagement record involving Earth's military in the Conclave's documented history shows the same pattern. Earth's forces in positions that the mathematical models say require retreat continue. Earth's forces in positions that the avoidance model says should produce avoidance behavior do not avoidance. They sit with it. He said, we have been analyzing this as a strategic characteristic, as a property of Earth's military doctrine or organizational culture. He said, it may also be a property of the species' relationship with fear itself. He said, they may not avoid in the way the avoidance model predicts because they have spent generations practicing not avoiding in controlled conditions. He said, the horror genre may not be a recreational curiosity. It may be a cultural technology for producing a specific type of human. Priyeth said, a human who has practiced sitting with fear. Voreth said, yes. She said, every human who has watched horror films has practiced sitting with fear. Voreth said, every human who has told or listened to frightening stories around a fire at the beginning of human cultural history has practiced sitting with fear. He said, the practice is ancient, it is cultural, it is transmitted from one generation to the next through the entertainment tradition. He said, every generation of humans has grown up with a cultural practice of voluntary fear exposure. The horror genre is the current technological form. Before the horror genre, there were horror stories. Before horror stories, there were whatever the first frightening narratives were that humans told each other before they had writing. He said, they have been inoculating themselves against avoidance for as long as they have had culture. The room was very quiet. Koran said, inoculation. Voreth said, It is the closest framework I have found. The principle of exposure to a managed version of a stimulus in order to reduce the automatic response to the actual stimulus. The horror genre is voluntary exposure to managed fear. The result, accumulated across generations of the practice, may be a species with a significantly reduced automatic avoidance response. He said, they are not fearless. The horror genre works because they still feel fear. They feel fear and they sit in it and they experience it and they do not leave and they call it entertainment. He said, and then they carry that practiced response into every other situation where fear is relevant. Koran looked at the display. He said, write it up. Thessaly said, the full analysis. He said, all of it. The production history, the academic literature, the inoculation framework, the operational implications, the connection to the historical narrative tradition. All of it. He said, and flag it for the Security Council's Cultural Analysis Division. Thessaly said, the Security Council. He said, yes. She said, it is a cultural analysis paper. He said, it is a cultural analysis paper that explains something about Earth that the Security Council's models have been treating as anomalous for 42 years. He said, the continuation variable, the pattern of Earth forces remaining in positions that should produce avoidance, the specific relationship with threat that Earth's military history documents. He said, we may have found the cultural mechanism that produces it. He said, in the queue. He said, in a file that had been sitting in the queue for 6 weeks. Thessaly said, yes. He said, flag it. She flagged it. The paper took 4 months to write. It was 47 pages. The Security Council's Cultural Analysis Division received it and assigned it to 3 senior analysts for review. The 3 senior analysts read it and produced a joint assessment. The assessment said, the paper's central claim, that the human horror genre represents a cultural technology for voluntary fear exposure with implications for the species' relationship with the avoidance response, is well supported by the evidence presented. The operational implications section is significant. The paper should be distributed to the full Security Council with a recommendation for incorporation into Earth-related strategic modeling. The assessment also included a section that the senior analysts had labeled additional observations, which was the section that assessment documents used for things that were accurate and important, but that did not fit cleanly into the formal analytical framework. The additional observations section said, the research team notes that the horror genre's existence raises a question that the paper does not fully address. The question is, why did this cultural practice develop in the first place? The inoculation framework describes what the horror genre does. It does not fully explain why a species would develop the cultural practice of voluntary fear exposure as entertainment. The additional observations section said, the most parsimonious explanation is that the practice developed because it was useful. Species develop cultural practices that are adaptive. A cultural practice of voluntary fear exposure would be adaptive in an environment where fear-induced avoidance was frequently maladaptive, where avoiding threat was less effective than remaining in the presence of threat and managing the response. The additional observations section said, this implies that the human environment during the formative period of their cultural development was one in which avoidance was frequently not a viable option. That fear was a constant rather than an occasional experience. That the species developed a cultural technology for managing fear because fear was too present to be avoided. The additional observations section said, the horror genre is not a recreational curiosity. It is the current form of a survival technology. The species developed it because they needed it. They kept it because it worked. They refined it across generations because the refinement improved the product and the product improved the species. The additional observations section said, the conclave species database describes Earth as a death world. The horror genre is what a death world species does with the experience of living on a death world. They make art out of it. They make entertainment out of it. They sit in the dark and they watch things designed to make them afraid, and they call it fun. The additional observations section said, they call it fun because for them the experience of manageable fear is not a negative state. It is a familiar state. It is the state they evolved in. The dark, the threat, the fear, and the continuing anyway. That is home for them. The horror genre brings them home in a safe way. The additional observations section ended with a sentence that one of the 3 senior analysts had added after the others had reviewed the document. A sentence that was not part of the formal analysis, and that the analyst had debated including and had included anyway because it was the most accurate single sentence the analyst had produced in 20 years of civilizational research. The sentence said, they invented horror movies because the universe was already a horror movie, and they wanted something scarier to compare it to. The paper was distributed to the full Security Council. It was read. It produced the specific quality of institutional silence that the Security Council produced when it received information that required significant revision of existing frameworks. Then Senior Arbiter Nellen filed a response. The response said, the Cultural Analysis Division's paper is noted. The Security Council recommends immediate incorporation of the inoculation framework into Earth-related modeling. The Security Council also recommends that the division continue reviewing the Cultural Exchange Protocol queue with priority attention. If the horror genre file was in the queue for 6 weeks, the Security Council would like to know what else is in the queue. She said, and what has been in the queue before? She said, and what Earth has been sending us for 14 years that we have been cataloging without review. The queue review took 8 months. It found 43 items of significant analytical interest that had been received, cataloged, and not reviewed. The 43 items were distributed to the research teams. The research teams began reading. In her office, Thessaly opened the next item on her list. She looked at the title. The title said, Entertainment Media, Comedy Genre, Feature Film, Runtime 112 Minutes. She ran a terminology search on the comedy genre. The search returned the definition. The definition said, a genre of entertainment designed to evoke amusement and laughter in the audience as a form of recreation. Thessaly looked at the definition. She thought about the horror genre and the inoculation framework and the 47-page paper and the Security Council's response. She thought about the comedy genre and what a species that had spent 11,000 years laughing in the dark at things designed to be funny might have developed from that practice. She opened a new working document. She started watching. Outside her office, the queue continued. Item by item. Each one a window. Each one a piece of the picture. Each one waiting for someone to open it and look.